42 million.
The art world, where paintings change hands for fortunes.
So, thank you very much.
But for every known masterpiece, there may be another still waiting to be discovered.
This is it.
International art dealer Philip Mould and I have teamed up to hunt for lost works by great artists. We use old-fashioned detective work and state-of-the-art science to get to the truth.
Science can enable us to see beyond the human eye.
Ta-da!
Oh, wow!
Every case is packed with surprise and intrigue.
Is it, or isn't it a Freud then?
But not every painting is quite what it seems.
Two artists rather than one.
It's a journey that can end in joy.
There is enough to support the conclusion that it is by Tom Roberts!
Or bitter disappointment.
I don't think it's a work by Gauguin. I'm very sorry.
In this episode, a first for Fake or Fortune, we investigate a sculpture.
What is it?
Could this curious piece of plaster be a rare abstract work by the man considered to be the greatest sculptor of the 20th century, Alberto Giacometti?
That sculpture really represents something extremely significant.
The darling of the art market, in 2015, one of his bronzes sold for $141 million, a world record. Could a family souvenir from 1930s Paris actually be a lost early work with an unfortunate history?
The cat knocked it over.
It's one of the most challenging investigations we've ever undertaken, and the prize is one of the most precious of all. But getting to the truth won't be easy in a world where forgeries are produced on an industrial scale. How many did you find?
1,300.
On the last series of Fake or Fortune, we asked viewers to contact us if they had a mystery work of art. We regularly receive emails and letters about paintings, but we've also been sent a tantalizing message about a piece of sculpture. I'm keen to share the lead with Philip, so we've arranged a rendezvous in a fitting location, a sculpture gallery in London's Victoria and Albert Museum.
Hello.
Hi, how you doing?
Hey, good, thanks. Well, I like where you've taken me. All these Renaissance treasures all over the place. Don't tell me someone found a Michelangelo in their back garden?
No, wouldn't that be nice? But there is a reason I've brought you here. I have here an email from one of our viewers. In your programme on Sunday, you mentioned an interest in works of art rather than just paintings. I therefore enclosed 2 photographs of the Giacometti gazing head, so a sculpture.
If we could get a Giacometti through, it would be a supremely important discovery. That's one of the great trophies of the 20th century, a sculpture by him.
Born in 1901 in the Swiss town of Berganovo, near the Italian border, Alberto Giacometti grew up in an artistic family. In the 1920s, he moved to Paris to study sculpture and became a regular in the city's cafes, rubbing shoulders with artists and intellectuals, such as Picasso and the Surrealists. By the end of the Second World War, Giacometti's obsessive desire to depict the human head and figure resulted in the works for which he is best known: thin, elongated faces and tall, spindly characters such as the walking man, often cast in bronze. By the time of his death in 1966, he was already hailed as one of the greatest sculptors of the 20th century, and his works amongst the most prized in modern art.
At £58 million, I'm going to sell one. Fair warning.
Could a family from the south of England have discovered one of Giacometti's earliest works, a strikingly thin square of plaster?
We've got to be so careful with sculptures. I mean, all of these treasures around us are in fact plaster replicas of the real thing. And take David over there. He's a Victorian copy of the Renaissance original.
I have an ominous feeling that telling the real thing from the fake may not be that straightforward.
This is new territory for us, and sculpture poses particular challenges for the art detective. We're probably most familiar with the idea of a sculptor chipping away at a piece of marble, such as the Kiss created by Auguste Rodin and his team. Many sculptors, though, Giacometti included, liked creating objects in soft materials such as clay that can be used to make a mould. This, in turn, allows them to create multiple editions of a work in plaster or bronze, all of which would be considered authentic.
We need to take a closer look at the plaster sculpture we've been contacted about to see just what we're dealing with. The incredibly fragile piece has been delivered to the gallery by specialist courier. We've asked owner Henrietta Plunkett and her mother, Claire Clark Hall, to come in and tell us everything they know about this extraordinary work, believed to be by Alberto Giacometti.
Hi there.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Nice to meet you. Hi.
Hello.
Should we have a look at your sculpture? What is it?
Well, it's a good question. Some people have thought it's a television when they first seen it, but it's actually supposed to be a sculpture by Alberto Giacometti. Of a gazing head.
I mean, it's so narrow, isn't it? It's straight through.
Yeah.
It's like a piece of paper.
That's what I love. I love the fact that when you see it from front on, with the lights, it looks like it's very deep, and then you go side on and it's not even 3 centimetres.
It's like a blade,
Yeah.
like a white blade.
I think it's absolutely wonderful. The more you see it and the more you live with it, I think the lovelier it is in a way.
If this is by Giacometti, and we were talking about something done in the 1920s, right at the early part of his career, and something that is extraordinarily abstract.
Encouragingly for Henrietta and Claire, their sculpture does bear a striking resemblance to an authentic Giacometti work. Known by the French name Tête qui regarde, or gazing head, this authentic version in stark white plaster was intended as a finished work of art and is held in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The museum also holds a bronze gazing head. All of these gazing head sculptures are genuine because they are known to have been made by Giacometti or under his close supervision. Could this be another one?
How did this extraordinary object come into your family?
Well, it was acquired by my grandmother, Fiona Garfit. We've got some photographs of her here, who later married my grandfather, Dennis Clark Hall.
These are great
She's
pictures.
very striking, isn't she?
Wow.
She was studying in Paris around the 1930s, and she used to sit for the artist Derain.
So she was painted by the great avant-garde painter André Derain.
Is it a travesty to say he didn't quite do her justice?
Well, we don't think so. I mean, her chin doesn't look quite right, and nor does her mouth, but he did do it in an afternoon.
And then she was also friends with the supposed mistress of Giacometti, and therefore she became acquainted with Giacometti.
That really puts her doing the right things in the right place at the right time.
She always liked his work, and we think that she returned to Paris once she'd married my grandfather Dennis. There's a photograph of him here.
Right.
And he was an architect. That's when we believe that they went back together to acquire this piece. We know that she wanted to get the bronze, but couldn't stretch to the bronze, so got the plaster instead.
So they bought this?
Yeah, and of course the plaster in a way is more special than the bronze. Well, I think it's more special than the bronze because, as you can see, it breaks very easily.
Yes. What's all this at the back here? I wasn't quite sure when the right moment would be to mention. It looks it's been through the wars.
Yeah, it
That
has.
was the cat knocked it over.
Knocked it off the mantelpiece. When it smashed into a million pieces, my grandfather just took it and sort of put a whole load of polyfiller and covered it in some paint.
Unfortunately, these crude DIY repairs have left the back of the sculpture looking nothing like the smooth, clean surface you'd expect to find in an authentic gazing head, which might pose problems.
As a sculpture, obviously condition is rather key. I mean, if a plaster has been broken, it is not as desirable as a perfect
Well, it
piece.
hasn't been.
But having said that, if this were a bronze, we'd be talking millions of pounds. But it's not a bronze, but it's a plaster. And Giacometti saw these plasters as completed, standalone works of art, depending on the condition. And that's a bit unfathomable at this stage. We could be talking hundreds of thousands of pounds. But the art world needs cold, hard facts if we're going to link this with the great man himself.
Got absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing.
And nothing other than a family story to actually place her within the orbit of Giacometti at all.
Exactly. And it's never been anywhere else because it's always been in the
It's
family.
always been at home.
Well, what we have to do with these images that you've got first is try and bring this back to the moment that Giacometti was making these things in Paris.
What a great challenge. I'm looking forward to it.
It's going to be fantastic.
We need to hit the ground running with our research in order to build a case to present to the Giacometti Committee in Paris, the authority who passed judgment on all newly discovered artworks. We will have to find out all we can about Giacometti and how he worked. So I'm heading to the Sainsbury Centre for the Visual Arts at the University of East Anglia, home of the UK's largest collection of Giacometti material and a well-stocked art library.
While Philip hits the books, I've found something useful in the BBC's own archives. A documentary about Giacometti made just a few years before his death in 1966. I've arranged to view it at the Cine Lumière cinema in London. Could it contain any material that might help us?
This tall figure stands outside the studio of Alberto Giacometti in Paris. He makes each figure or head, effaces it, remakes it over and over again.
With those long, slender, attenuated figures, he's taking the medium of clay and stretching it to the absolute limit of what it can achieve. It's thrilling to watch Giacometti at work. You can see him coaxing his ideas to life in clay, constantly shaping and modelling the brittle faces and bodies he'd go on to cast in plaster and bronze. Fascinating to see his studio, and yet he's surrounded by clutter. Bags of clay, broken pieces, bits of sculpture. Yet it was in this cramped, dimly lit space in the bohemian quarter of Montparnasse in Paris that Giacometti worked for over 40 years, often labouring 15 hours at a stretch in a haze of cigarette smoke.
It's clear from the many books about Giacometti that when he first arrived in that studio in December 1926, he was a sculptor in search of an identity. I've been trying to find out just how he came up with the idea for the gazing head and how important Henrietta's sculpture could be. So Giacometti comes to Paris in the 1920s. He studies as a classical sculptor. He works with a guy called Bourdelle. He learns the traditional way of doing things. But what's so obvious from what you read is that he was desperate to do something different. He was itching to express himself. And then there's a big moment. In 1927, he goes and stays with his parents, goes back to Switzerland, and produces something rather remarkable, an image of his father without any profile at all. Here you have it, that flat face, but with these quite pronounced ears. Something's happening, something's changing. Later that year, Giacometti becomes even more daring. Drawing inspiration from the abstract angles of Cubism and African tribal art, he creates the very first gazing head, a stark white square of plaster set with two shallow grooves. He's purifying ideas from his imagination. It's part of a different way of approaching sculpture. He calls them plaques, rather two-dimensional images. We have the perfect quote to work out what's going on in his thinking. If I look at you from the front, I forget the profile. If I look at the profile, I forget the front. I mean, that says it all about our sculpture. I mean, it's a profile, yet it's the front. It's almost as if he's just getting rid of that complicated third dimension altogether, the things that classically he would have been taught. It's a moment of great change in art history. And I'm just wondering whether Henrietta has reflected on just how significant this might be.
It's clear that Gazing Head marked a significant breakthrough for Giacometti. It was a wildly experimental piece of sculpture, and it takes pride of place in the roll call of his most important works. Great to see an original version of Giacometti's Gazing Head in that footage. We don't know if Henrietta's is the real thing or not, but having seen that, it's clear that Giacometti's obsessive nature and quest for perfection drove him to revisit the same themes and ideas over and over again.
There's a way to make an entrance.
This is my destiny.
It was now a conspiracy of witches.
Download Veely today.
Which might go some way to explaining why there could be several versions of Gazing Head, and Henrietta's might be one of them.
To find out just how Giacometti might have gone about making multiple versions of Gazing Head in plaster, we need a crash course in the practical art of sculpture. Hines Sculpture Studios in Basildon produce everything from movie props to giant art installations, working in modern resins and fiberglass as well as traditional materials such as plaster and clay. Aidan himself has agreed to show us the process Giacometti is likely to have used to create the very first Gazing Head, so Claire and I are on our way to meet him.
Very good to see you, Aidan. This is Claire.
Hello, Aidan.
We have a sculpture, a plaster, which we think may be by Giacometti. Now, as a plaster, can you give us some insight as to how he might have made it, how he might have started?
Well, I think initially they would do sketches, or they work straight from the head and then transferred up with their hands to the clay.
I see. So you can't just sculpt in plaster. You have to first, a bit like a sketch for a painting, you have to create it in clay.
You can have ideas in drawing, but once you see it in 3D, you think, oh, that's not quite how I liked it. So you can alter it and play until your heart's content.
Clay was Giacometti's favoured material and reflected his desire to shape and model rather than carve his sculptures. As clay will quickly dry out and fall apart, the next stage of the process is to turn the model into something more robust, like a plaster. To do that, Giacometti would have first created a mould of his clay model, dividing it in two and coating both sides with liquid plaster.
I'm using a flick technique and I'm going all over into every little piece of detail I have, and there's no time to stop.
And you go on until it's completely...
You go on till this side's completely covered, and the main thing about flicking it is you're taking all the air pockets from your plaster away as well.
Once the outer shell of the mould has hardened, it can be split in two and the clay removed, leaving a space in the shape of the original model. This is the mould, and once it's been coated with a lubricant and clamped together, it's ready to be filled with liquid plaster, just like a jelly mould. Once it's set, you've got your first plaster cast. To demonstrate this stage of the process, Aidan is using a working mould of a woman's face.
So this is all ready to accept now the wet plaster?
It is, yeah. First of all, we have to add a kind of Vaseline mix and then brush it into the whole mould, which then separates the new plaster from the old.
And they would have used Vaseline, would they?
I think they may have used like an animal fat or a lard, or something at least greasy, which acts as a separator for the two.
So once you've covered it like this and it goes hard, you can then crack it apart and hey presto, you've got your mould.
That's it, and you can use it again and again.
Watching Aidan at work, I'm starting to understand how Giacometti might have felt as he filled his first Gazing Head mould with plaster and waited with bated breath for his fragile creation to emerge from its cocoon.
This is the idea made solid.
Yeah, it's exactly like replica of the clay.
And we know Giacometti saw these plasters as finished works of art.
A lot of people often make bronzes, but he is quite happy with his plaster.
It must be very exciting when you first take it out. And you're not quite sure.
Well, you never, you know, like, especially as it translates from clay to plaster, it looks different altogether. And it's almost that reveal that makes it special, I think.
If I wanted to fake one of these sculptures and I could manage to get hold of a genuine Giacometti plaster, could I easily replicate it?
I could.
Not really what we want to hear, and I'm sure you wouldn't.
No, I wouldn't. No. Providing you have a master of his, you can make as many copies as you like.
The fact that sculptures can be so easily replicated poses huge problems when it comes to determining authenticity. How can an expert tell whether a piece is the work of Alberto Giacometti or an imposter? Back in London, I'm going in search of professional advice. I've arranged to meet Edward Horswell, an art dealer who specialises in sculpture, at his gallery in Mayfair.
So, we have a plaster, we hope, by Giacometti. What would you be looking at to try and establish its authenticity?
Firstly, we'd do our due diligence before we contacted any authority on the artist. So we would be looking very closely at the provenance. Then we would be looking very carefully at the object itself, and then I think that I would want to go and look at the other examples of the same subject, because the best that your sculpture could be would be an undiscovered version.
So the best case then for Henrietta is that her sculpture is a lost original by Giacometti himself. But a glance around Edwards' gallery reveals the bewildering variation you can find in the world of sculpture. This pretty little figure by French sculptor Mayol might look like a work of art, but it's actually a less refined copy with a more functional purpose.
Because the artist's final plaster original was very delicate, the first thing the foundry would do, they would cast another plaster, which they would give to the workman so that they knew how to finish off the bronze, because they didn't want to give them the artist's original because they might knock it over on the workbench.
So there'd be a sort of working plaster. How can anyone keep track of that?
With great difficulty.
When it comes to whether our plaster is genuine or not, what do you think our options are?
Well, I think it's one of three things. Firstly, it's an original plaster made by Giacometti. Secondly, it could be a plaster made at the foundry from an original plaster of Giacometti. Or thirdly, it's a fraudulent recreation made to deceive.
How difficult is it for the Giacometti committee to establish a real Giacometti from one that isn't?
I think it's getting harder and harder. In the old days, we were dealing with flea market fakes. Nowadays, we're dealing with much more sophisticated forgeries where people are fabricating provenance. So the task is getting harder and harder.
If Edward's advice wasn't sobering enough, we also have to deal with the fact that Henrietta's sculpture has been badly damaged at some point in its life and then crudely restored. I've asked Derek Pullen, formerly head of sculpture conservation at the Tate Gallery, to carry out a technical examination of Henrietta's gazing head. Now a freelance sculpture specialist, Derek has over 30 years of expertise and is often called in to investigate mystery works.
So, Derek, what are we dealing with here?
Well, it certainly looks like a Giacometti, but what stage in the process of making a Giacometti this piece is, I'm not sure. It seems to be plaster. Certainly, if we look at the underside here, that's raw plaster there. I'm catching a sort of gloss on those yellow areas, which suggests that they might be shellac, which is used to seal plaster, partly to stop it getting dirty, but partly so that a mould can be taken off the plaster.
So you can infer from that shellac that this might be part of a process, moving from one type of object to another.
This could be at the beginning of the making of the Giacometti sculpture, or it could have been a plaster that was cast from a mould somewhere along the line, perhaps when they were making a bronze.
The crude repairs carried out by Henrietta's grandfather in the late 1960s, after the incident with the cat, are plain to see. But is there anything else going on beneath the surface?
The whole object, apart from areas that we can see here, is covered with, what, a later paint?
It's covered with, I think, white emulsion. That's not surprising. It's quite normal for people to paint them, unfortunately. For a start, it covers up some of the damage at first sight.
One way to test the credibility of Henrietta's sculpture is to measure it. The dimensions of other authentic gazing head sculptures are well documented. How does this version compare?
40.6.
Well, we have here 40, so as far as its dimensions are concerned, it looks fit for purpose.
It's always an approximation, but I'm quite happy with those dimensions being close enough for the time being.
So that's a health test that's passed?
Yes, I think it's good enough.
So is there any way of establishing how it's been repaired here and now?
Well, we can use a magnet to see if there's any metal, any iron and steel. I'm going to tilt it back slightly. I think what we'll do is sort of investigate the cracks first. Nothing along that line. But I'm getting I'm getting a sense, yeah, there's something here.
Yes.
And it gets stronger there where the plaster is a little thinner.
Well, what might be beneath?
Well, it's quite common, especially in older repairs, to put some metal reinforcements to connect the two broken parts.
One has to ask the question, who would go to the trouble if this were a fake to repair it in that way?
Whoever did it was taking it very seriously.
If Henrietta's sculpture was the subject of a much earlier and more sophisticated repair than her grandfather's DIY job, this could provide crucial evidence of its age. It should be over 80 years old if it was bought by Fiona Garfit and Dennis Clark Hall after they married in 1936. But can we find any proof that they encountered Giacometti around this time? I've been looking into their early lives in search of clues. Born in 1910, Dennis Clark Hall was a successful architect who made his name with a bold, modernist design for a secondary school in 1937. He moved in artistic circles, helping to renovate a studio in Cassis in the south of France, frequented by Picasso and the English art collector Roland Penrose, a keen supporter of the Surrealists and of Alberto Giacometti. The most promising lead we have to go on, though, is the family story that Fiona may have crossed paths with Giacometti when she was studying in Paris in the 1930s.
Hi there. Hi, Fiona.
I've arranged to meet Henrietta in Montparnasse to try and piece together more information about her grandmother's time in Paris. And I want to share a discovery I've made in the audio archives of the British Library.
Remarkably, I found an interview with your grandfather, with Dennis Clark Hall,
really?
which was done as part of a collection of interviews with great architects of the time.
Yeah.
And he is talking about his experiences here in Paris. So I thought your grandfather, through his interview, could be our guide to Paris.
Amazing. Well, I've never even knew he'd done it, and I've certainly never heard it.
Well, let me play some of it for you.
We had this sort of marvellous time wandering around Paris. Fiona took me to the Louvre one time. Suddenly realised what painting was all about. She used to go, when she wanted a bit of money, she'd model for somebody. Darren took a fancy to her, and he painted masses of her. Anyway, she had this studio in Paris, just opposite the Dome, in the Rue de la Grande Chaumière, and she was attending this art school in Grande Chaumière.
And this is it. This is the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, where your grandmother studied. So let's go and have a look.
Great.
Founded in 1904, the Académie de la Grande Chaumière offered painting and sculpture classes to aspiring artists.
So, Henny, come with me through here. I just want to show you what's going on in this room. As you can see, they're just preparing for a life class here. And this is where, in the 1930s, your grandmother came to study.
How amazing.
And 10 years before that, this is where Giacometti studied.
No, they both studied here.
Yes.
That's a wonderful coincidence to think that they were both here at some point in
Exactly.
their lives.
And just as you can see everyone getting ready here for a life drawing class, it would have been just the same for your grandmother and for Giacometti. People getting the stools down, arranging their easels, the model up there on the stage with a little heater to keep the model
keep her warm.
Yes.
Like Fiona Garfit, Giacometti was drawn to Paris by the prospect of learning from the greats, such as influential French sculptor Antoine Bourdelle. He attended classes at the Academy between 1922 and 1925, but just a few years later he was tearing up the rule book in pursuit of something far more radical.
This is what he said about gazing head. I began by wanting to make from memory exactly what I'd seen of the model. I started well enough by analysing her figure, with the legs, the head, the arms, but it all seemed wrong. To get nearer to my idea, I had to sacrifice more and more, to reduce it, leave the head off, the arms, everything. All that remained of the figure was this plaque. That's what he calls it, a plaque, which is a perfect name for
It's
it.
a perfect description, isn't it? Because it really is, because it's so thin, it's just like that.
It's a pared-down form, and his interpretation of what he saw there on the stage back in the 1920s.
While Fiona and Henrietta continue their research in Paris, I'm at the Sainsbury's Centre for the Visual Arts in East Anglia. I've arranged to meet curator Calvin Winner, guardian of the treasures that the Sainsbury family acquired from Giacometti, such as this portrait of his brother, Diego, seated. I want to find out how British visitors to Paris, like the Sainsburys and Fiona and Dennis before them, might have gone about buying a Giacometti work.
Given that we lack crucial paperwork about how this sculpture may have got into the family, can you give me some idea of what might happen if you wanted to buy a work by Giacometti?
There are various options. I mean, you could go to a gallery like Pierre Liobe, who's a very well-known dealer.
Who represented
He represented Giacometti at the time. If you had an introduction to Giacometti himself in perhaps one of the cafes of Paris, and then Giacometti may take you to his studio.
So it could have been a bohemian moment here. You knock into the artist at the bar and you go back home and buy a piece of art from him.
It's certainly possible, and it's not unusual for that to happen.
The casual nature of so many of these exchanges in the art world of the 1930s can make it extremely difficult to establish a clear provenance for an artwork. We know that Giacometti exhibited his first gazing head plaster at the fashionable Jean Boucher Gallery in Paris in June 1929, and that this piece was snapped up by Charles and Marie-Laure de Nouailly, patrons of the Surrealist art group. But how many more did he make? And could Henrietta's piece be another version of this breakthrough sculpture?
What I'd love to do, Calvin, is show you our image and get your response to it.
Right. It certainly looks very reminiscent of Giacometti's work from the late 1920s. The forms are reduced down to their sort of essential elements.
So, just give me an idea, if we could prove that this was a gazing head by Giacometti, how significant would it be?
I think that to discover plasters is always very interesting. They're incredibly friable and fragile, so they don't always survive. For this to suddenly appear is very, very interesting.
So would it be true to say that if we could attach the magic name Giacometti to this, that is the sort of piece that would find a place in an esteemed collection like the Sainsbury Centre?
If the provenance is right and we can attach Giacometti's name to it, I'm sure we'd find room for it.
Back in Paris, Henrietta and I are continuing the hunt for any points at which Fiona and Dennis might have crossed paths with Giacometti during the 1930s. A period Dennis evokes in colourful detail.
We had this sort of marvellous time wandering around Paris and finding things. There was 70 francs to the pound, and you had a three-course meal and a quarter bottle of wine for 5 francs. So you could really sort of do quite well.
Paris was a haven for artists, writers and musicians. It was a world where you might find yourself rubbing shoulders with Picasso or Hemingway in the Dome Cafe.
Henny, I wanted to bring you here to this cafe restaurant called the Dome because it plays an important part in the story of your sculpture and of the visits that your grandfather made here to Paris to visit your grandmother. So have a listen to this.
Used to meet people in the Dome and got friendly with things. I remember sitting at a table, couldn't understand a word he said because I couldn't speak French, chatting away with Giacometti and all these sort of people are there.
So your grandfather was sitting at a table, maybe even this table, who knows, with your grandmother.
With some chap he couldn't understand.
With some chap he couldn't understand because he was talking in French. He was sitting with Giacometti.
How incredible.
So this is the evidence that your grandfather and grandmother met Giacometti and they hung out with him. And I presume they were friends. I presume your grandmother was friends with him. They were sharing a table. They must have known each other reasonably well. So imagine what it was like here. Giacometti was beginning to make a name for himself. He was in his 30s. He was beginning to sell some of his works, but nonetheless, he wasn't wealthy. So he was turning his hand to other things. He made jewellery, for example. He made artefacts and props for Man Ray's photographic studio. He made bits of furniture. So it's possible that when your grandfather and grandmother decided to buy a plaster sculpture by Giacometti, if indeed it is by Giacometti, it might not have cost him that much money. So we know that your grandfather and grandmother hung out with Giacometti. I mean, are there other names that have come down the family folklore that your grandmother mentioned?
Well, we know that Fiona's great friend in Paris was a woman called Isabelle Rawsthorne.
Isabelle Rawsthorne?
They spent a lot of time together.
What, your grandmother and Isabelle Rawsthorne?
My grandmother and Isabelle Rawsthorne, yeah.
Right. Maybe we should try and find out a little bit more about her.
I'm picking up the investigation into the enigmatic Isabel Rawsthorne at the Sainsbury Centre with the help of curator Calvin Winner, who's researched her colourful life. Born in London in 1912, Isabel Rawsthorne was an accomplished painter and moved in artistic circles throughout her life. But it's her time in Paris before the Second World War that's of most interest to us, when we believe she was close to both Fiona Garfitt and Alberto Giacometti, who immortalised her in several sculptures.
This is a bronze from about 1937-38 of the English artist Isabel Rawsthorne, and it's one of a number of bronzes that Giacometti created of Isabel. The features are delicate and sensitive, but at the same time it still remains quite an expressive sculpture.
So can you tell me something about her, where she fits in?
So when she came to Paris, she enrolled in the Académie de la Grande Chamerie, which a number of English artists studied at.
But hang on a moment, that's the same place as the grandmother of our owner studied.
It was a place where English artists often went to when they arrived in Paris.
So what was her connection with Giacometti?
Isabel Rawsthorne was a striking beauty, and all the artists of that moment were clearly interested in her. And Giacometti, likewise, then produced a number of works of her in sculpture, but also drawing. And they were certainly very close in the latter part of the 1930s and then in the 1940s as well.
Giacometti claimed that his thin, elongated female figures were inspired by a glimpse of Isabel on the streets of Paris. The intimacy between them is vividly captured in a period photograph that has recently come to light, dating from the very start of their relationship.
She met Giacometti in 1935 in the Dome Cafe, and
they just sort of bumped into each other, did they?
I think there's a possibility she was introduced by the artist Derain, who had already painted her portrait.
Audrey Derain. Now that's a name that means something to us, because the grandmother of our owner was also painted by Derain. They have the portraits still to this day.
It's very interesting. I mean, it places her in amongst those artists at that moment.
We still lack the firm documentary proof, but the circumstantial evidence is really stacked up today. I mean, Henrietta's grandmother was in Paris at the right time, the right place, the right group of people. I mean, she must have known Giacometti. The stakes are unquestionably getting higher.
Encouraged by what we found out about Fiona and Dennis's connections to the Paris art scene, I'm keen to take a closer look at the sculpture itself. Could deeper scientific analysis reveal any evidence that it's the work of Alberto Giacometti? Derek's magnet tests suggested there could be some kind of metal support inside the plaster. So we've arranged for the gazing head to be scanned with specialist equipment usually reserved for animals. Henrietta and Claire and I have come to the Royal Veterinary College in Hatfield. We've arranged to meet Professor Renata Vella, an expert in diagnostic imaging, the science of looking inside the body. Renata spends most of her time analysing injuries to animals, but after hours has been known to use her equipment on more unusual subjects, such as Egyptian mummies.
Well, Renata, thank you so much for allowing us. Now, I know that you're obviously a dab hand when it comes to animals, but what about works of art? Have you done anything comparable? Have you done old things at all?
Yeah, we have done a fair few fossils. So we do get researchers to come in who want to know more about how their fossils look inside. So we have done that, but never a piece of art. So shall I?
Okay.
There.
Are you ready to hand it over?
Yeah. Okay.
It's over to you, Renata. Good luck.
Thank you very much, and hopefully we'll know more in 5 minutes. Carly, look what I brought you today.
Thank you.
Henrietta's sculpture is about to undergo a CT scan, which stands for computed tomography. It works by taking X-rays from many different angles to first produce a cross-section of the object.
Oh, I can see all the lines.
It is like watching a patient, isn't it?
Yes.
Your patient.
Or being one.
Yeah.
Once Renata has combined the results of the CT scan with standard X-ray images, a three-dimensional image of the sculpture can be created, and we can see beyond the surface paint layer deep into the plaster itself.
So this is a very significant moment. We're going to find out what lies inside your sculpture.
Right, shall we do this?
Yeah.
So we have 665 slices of your statue. They go literally through like this. So we are starting at the edge. The widest part is that base. We are now in the middle. So the first thing you see is nails.
There's no mistaking the DIY handiwork of Henrietta's grandfather. Embedded in the plaster are 3 household nails, crudely driven into the broken sections to hold it all together.
I mean, to me, the nails were placed for repair. This is how you would repair a fracture in an animal, or a human for that matter. They cross the fracture line or the break line. So I would have thought this is what somebody has done to repair it.
What's interesting is that where those nails seem to be impaled, seems to be a different material to the material behind.
But to me, it looks like somebody has poured this into some shape, and then it gave it these layers here.
Well, that could be liquid plaster, couldn't it?
Could be, yes.
I mean, that's what perhaps one would expect.
Absolutely, but what's completely different is actually
Which is like, it's solid, it's sort of like concrete in comparison.
It's a surprising discovery. The sculpture appears to have 2 separate elements, the main body of the work, and then 2 edges made from a distinctly different material that appear to have been pinned or stapled in place.
Well, if we go over here to where those pins are, they are very superficial, and they're right at the border between the main structure and that extra bit on the outside.
There's some real surprises here. There's more going on than I was expecting.
With so many puzzling aspects to Henrietta's sculpture, could it be the work of someone other than Alberto Giacometti? Research online reveals the alarming extent to which Giacometti has been the target of forgers, and I've travelled to the German city of Stuttgart to find out about a scandal that rocked the art world. In 2001, a district attorney in Switzerland notified the Stuttgart police about a number of fake bronzes changing hands for millions of euros. It was the beginning of the most audacious Giacometti forgery case ever seen. I've arranged to meet retired investigator Wolfgang Schönleber to find out how it was carried out.
Guten Tag. Hello, nice to meet you. So these are the forgeries?
These are the faked bronzes.
Wow, look at those. If you don't know Giacometti, they're quite convincing.
It's Giacometti, but not so...
Not so fine. No, of course not.
For almost 10 years, a gang of forgers churned out fake Giacomettis in both bronze and plaster, devising an ingenious false provenance to explain the origins of their work, a book called Diego's Revenge, that purported to tell the story of Giacometti's brother, Diego, and his secret stash of previously unseen sculptures.
Die Täter verwendeten gefälschte Echtheitszertifikate und verwendeten auch fantasievolle Geschichten und Legenden, wie etwa in dem Buch Diegos Rache dann beschrieben.
It's brilliantly simple in a way. Write a book, a biography of Giacometti's brother, call it Diego's Revenge, claim that the brother inherited hundreds of statues, and suddenly you have a new stash of work by Alberto Giacometti.
The ringleaders of the gang were finally arrested in 2009. When Wolfgang's team raided the gang's warehouse in Mainz, they were stunned by what they found.
There's so many of them. How many did you find?
1,300.
Wow. What did you think when you went in the room and saw all this?
Wir haben Probleme, diese überhaupt zu asservieren, abzutransportieren, zu bewerten. Das war eine gigantische Aufgabe.
Most of the vast haul of fakes was eventually destroyed, but countless others are still likely to be in circulation.
I noticed that you've got a plaster cast here. Did you find many plaster casts amongst all these forgeries?
160 Gipsformen dabei.
Well, that was fascinating. To hear about those Giacomettis being forged on such an epic scale. And I can understand why the Giacometti committee is so wary about accepting new pieces of work when there are so many fakes out there. And of course, the difficulty with Henrietta's piece is that we have no hard and fast evidence as to how long it's been in her family and how old it is. And so they may well be tempted with Henrietta's piece to err on the side of caution and not accept it as a genuine work. I can see why they might do that.
With Fiona's trip to Germany revealing just how extensively Giacometti's work has been forged, it's more important than ever to prove that Henrietta's sculpture is a work that dates back to the sculptor's lifetime, perhaps as early as the late 1920s. Derek Pullen, a renowned specialist in sculpture conservation, has been studying the CT scan of the gazing head and carrying out further research. Henrietta and I have arranged to meet him at the Bronze Age Foundry in Limehouse in East London.
Very good to see you, Derek. You've had time now to look at the CT scans?
Well, we've got some really interesting results. There are at least 2 breaks. I think there's been at least 2, probably 3 restorations done on this piece.
Yeah, because we saw all of these extraordinary sort of pins and things like that. And we weren't able to make it out, but 3.
You can see the old glue line running across the top of the sculpture, and then this second break, which has also been glued, but it's also got these staples and nails in it. And these staples clip the broken parts together. But at some point, that broke again. The piece fell over. It's very unstable, very narrow base, and it was much more crudely repaired. And I think this is the plaster that's on the back of the piece.
Yeah.
Yes.
Their guess is who did that.
They've used just ordinary iron nails, and this is what we picked up with the magnet.
Yes.
They've used iron nails to reinforce the break. The other very interesting thing is that if you look at the scan more closely, the body of the sculpture has got this very textured, swirly look, and yet the pieces that have been added, well, one of them is completely smooth and the other seems to have smooth and textured parts to it.
And so what we're seeing here is 2 materials stapled together by a series of campaigns over the last, 50, 60, 70, 80 years?
That's right. And of course the stapling technique is a really very old-fashioned technique. And I don't know anyone who still uses that technique for repairing sculptures or ceramics. So I tried something myself as a little experiment last night. And this is just a piece of plaster that I cast into a yogurt pot top and inserted these bent wire staples. There's no glue there. They're holding this together.
Oh, absolutely. Like paper clips almost.
Just exactly like paper clips.
What period do you associate this process with?
I've seen 18th century porcelain, earlier porcelain done, but I think pretty sure it stopped when modern adhesives became available after the Second World War.
So someone, quite a long time ago, took a lot of trouble to repair this.
Yes.
It seems likely that the sculpture was at some point damaged and then professionally restored, perhaps in a foundry during a bronze-making process, with new pieces cast in plaster to replace fragments that had been broken beyond repair. But I'm hoping there is one scenario we can discount.
So Derek, asking you to put yourself into the mind of a forger, which I obviously know is an alien prospect for you, but could you imagine one going through this intricate process that you've just explained to us?
It's just too convoluted a process to invent all these steps and then cover them up and try and pass the piece off as original.
So in other words, there's too many random happenings, too much biography to this object for it to be something that's been sort of synthesized by a faker.
My feeling is that at some early point in its existence, that Giacometti or Giacometti's studio was involved.
How good are your instincts?
Excellent, of course.
But you've handled a lot, haven't you?
I've looked at a lot of Giacometti's.
Do you get a feel, a sense that we are close to the man himself, to Giacometti?
Just a feel, but I can't say more than that at the moment.
Our investigation has reached a critical stage. We're confident that Henrietta's sculpture shows evidence of the age and wear of a work from Giacometti's lifetime. The extent to which it's been damaged and repaired would make it seem an unlikely forgery. The provenance, although anecdotal, shows that Fiona and Dennis Clark Hall were immersed in the art world of the 1930s and had contact with Giacometti. The only other potential sources of evidence lie with the Giacometti Committee itself, and they have requested that we deposit Henrietta's sculpture with them in Paris so they can carry out research in their own archives. This could be Henrietta's last hope of hard evidence in favour of her gazing head. I've just come out of the Giacometti Foundation, which is just down the end of this alleyway here, and handed over Henrietta's sculpture. We met the head of sculptures. She had a look at Henrietta's plaque. She noted all the damage on it. As we know, the damage is considerable. But she certainly took it seriously, and I felt it was very positive. Although the committee promised to report back within a few weeks, they contacted us to say they needed more time to conduct further research. 4 months later, we've asked Henrietta and Claire to join us back at the gallery to consider the latest developments. Hi, nice to see you.
Hello.
Henny and Claire. It's been some time since we met and since your plaster was placed in the care of the Giacometti Committee.
Perhaps that's not altogether surprising, given that we are dealing with a sculpture and something that has been done in versions.
So they sent us a letter. Unfortunately, complicated cases like your plaster take time to be examined. A decision will be given when the committee is ready. No authorization will be given before this. So we've hit the buffers with the committee for the moment.
They're totally non-committal in it. They're not, no idea, sense of time, no sense of...
No. But rather than just end it there, we had a bit of a rethink. Because so far we've been working from your plaster back to Giacometti. That's what we've been trying to do. So then we thought, what if we worked from Giacometti forward and see if we could come to your plaster that way?
Yeah.
So what we've managed to find out, and it's been surprisingly difficult, is that there are at least 5 known plasters of Gazing Head, possibly 6. That's how many are out there.
Oh, really?
It's not many.
Not many.
More than I thought.
Now, what I want to do is show you this image, which is of one of them. It's a plaster. Now, have a look at it and see if anything strikes you.
That it's been broken in 1, 2, 3 places?
Bang on.
No?
It's been broken.
This authentic gazing head in the National Museum of Modern Art in Rome clearly bears the scars of the complex restoration that took place in 1978 after it was discovered in pieces.
Looks familiar, doesn't it?
It does look familiar.
It was owned by Roland Penrose, and he was an art critic and collector. In fact, he was even in business with your grandfather at one point, making camouflage just before the war.
Yes, I knew about the camouflage.
It's encouraging to find a genuine gazing head that was once in an even worse condition than Henrietta's. But what we are more interested in are any that Giacometti is known to have made, whose present whereabouts are now unknown.
Have a look at this. This is from an exhibition in April 1936 called Modern Pictures for Modern Rooms, and it was organised by an S.J. Woods and a Duncan Miller. And in this exhibition was for sale an Alberto Giacometti Tête qui Regarde, so gazing head like yours. It was a plaster, and it was sold for £22, which is about, in today's money, £1,000.
Oh my goodness.
But there's something else rather intriguing, because later in that year, possibly the same sculpture, in fact it seems quite likely, was exhibited at a place called the International Surrealist Exhibition. And here, if you cast your eye down...
Yeah, head with looks.
Head which looks, so gazing head.
Yeah.
Lent by
S.
John Woods, Esquire, London.
Sidney John Woods trained as an artist and graphic designer and had a passion for abstract art. In the 1930s, he knew people in the same social circles as Fiona and Dennis Clark Hall.
We contacted Sidney John Woods' family. He died in 1997. So we spoke to his daughter. We asked her where their gazing head is. She doesn't know. It's no longer in the family. So the question is, what happened to it? So what we're wondering is it possible that while your grandmother, and then through her, your grandfather, hung out with Giacometti, knew people in that circle in Paris, rather than buying Gazing Head in Paris, is it possible that they bought it from Sidney, someone in England, Sidney John Woods, in England sometime after 1936 when it was exhibited here? Because no one knows where this is now.
Because we knew that she'd met Giacometti, it just seemed to be the natural connection that she'd therefore acquired it in Paris. But of course, it isn't necessarily the fact. I mean, she could easily have acquired it over here. We don't know that she didn't.
So we have a tantalising provenance gap with another sculpture that could be yours. But this missing link in the provenance is something that, tragically, so far has eluded us.
Yes.
But probably not forever.
To be continued. Well, I said at the beginning this would be difficult, and it has been difficult. We've never tackled sculpture before, and it's been astonishingly hard to find out information about Giacometti's gazing heads and the plaster versions in particular.
But let's remember what we started with. I mean, no real provenance to speak of, covered with household paint, knocked over by the cat. I can't help feeling we got warmer. And my guess is, we'll get there on this.
After further weeks of research, the Giacometti Committee disclosed their provisional findings. They believe Henrietta's sculpture was once an original gazing head sculpture created by Alberto Giacometti for exhibition. Unfortunately, though, the damage that Henrietta's piece has sustained might be too great. It may no longer be possible to accept it as a genuine work. But more recent forensic research on Henrietta's sculpture has yielded encouraging elements. And the Giacometti Committee continues its work. They'll report their findings in the future.